February 20th, 1943, North African desert just north of Kasserine Pass. German tank commanders are watching something that shouldn't be possible. 5 American Sherman tanks moving through dust and smoke like they're reading each other's minds. Here's the thing. There's no line of sight between them. No flags, no flares, no messengers racing between vehicles. Yet they're converging on German positions with timing that looks supernatural. Every tank covering blind spots the others can't see. Every crew knowing exactly where their buddies are positioned. Meanwhile, the Germans in their Panzer IVs can barely hear their own company leaders through the static screaming in their headsets. Their radios are supposedly state-of-the-art, but they can't penetrate more than a few hundred meters when the tanks are moving. Most German tanks can only listen. They can't even call for help. What those German crews witnessed that morning wasn't magic. It was something they didn't know existed, and it would change warfare forever. Hit that like button and subscribe with notifications on, because what you're about to learn isn't in any history textbook. This invisible weapon changed everything, and Germany never saw it coming. The Americans were operating with technology the Germans didn't know existed, while those Panzer IVs were equipped with what Germany called cutting-edge FUG-5 radios. They were drowning in static. Their 10-watt transmitters could barely push a signal a few hundred meters when the tanks were actually moving. And here's the wild part. Most German tanks didn't even have transmitters. They could only listen. No ability to respond, no way to report what they saw, no way to call for help. The platoon leader would bark orders, and everyone else just had to acknowledge through their actions, not their words. If you weren't the command tank, you were basically fighting blind with your mouth taped shut. Now get this, every single American Sherman tank had a full two-way radio system, not just the command vehicles, every single one. The SCR 508 radio sets pumped out 25 watts of power, more than double what the Germans had. But the real game changer wasn't just the power. It was the technology itself. These radios used frequency modulation, FM, the same tech that would later revolutionize civilian radio. While German amplitude modulation systems picked up every spark plug firing, every electrical motor, every bit of interference as noise, American FM radios delivered crystal-clear voice communication even when artillery was pounding around them. Think about what that meant on the battlefield. German crews struggling to hear anything through the static. American crews talking to each other like they were on a phone call. The transformation had started back in July 1941 when the US Army standardized these radio systems for all medium tanks. Engineers at Galvin Manufacturing, later known as Motorola, had cracked something massive. Daniel Noble and Henrik Magnoski figured out how to stuff 181 pounds of sophisticated electronics into the brutal environment of a combat tank. They'd created something that turned every Sherman into a node in what was basically the world's first battlefield network. The system wasn't just about talking. It had dual receivers, which meant commanders could monitor multiple frequencies at the same time. While a German tank commander could barely hear one scratchy channel, American commanders were listening to multiple conversations, coordinating with infantry, calling in artillery, all simultaneously. The Germans were fighting with walkie-talkies from the 1930s. The Americans had brought the future to North Africa, and nobody on the other side had a clue what was hitting them. November 8, 1942. Operation Torch brought American armor to North Africa, and those SCR 508 radios were about to show just how broken the German system really was. The 2nd Armoured Division's tanks rolled off the landing ships near Safi and Fadala with full radio capability in every single vehicle. The Afrika Korps was supposed to be the Wehrmacht's most experienced armoured force, veterans who'd been fighting in the desert for over a year. But they were fighting with one hand tied behind their back, and they didn't even fully realize it yet. Here's how bad the German situation was. A standard tank platoon had 5 vehicles, right? Only 1 or 2 of those actually had full FUG-5 transceivers that could send and receive. The rest? They got stuck with FUG-2 receivers, listen-only mode. They could hear the platoon leader giving orders, but they couldn't talk back. Couldn't report enemy positions. Couldn't warn anybody about threats. Couldn't ask for help if things went sideways. Imagine being in a firefight and you can hear your boss, but you can't tell him there's 3 enemy tanks rolling up on his blind side. That's what German tank crews were dealing with every single day. The whole thing ran on rigid hierarchy. Platoon leader transmits, everyone else responds through their actions. You see the order, you follow it, end of story. No discussion, no coordination between the individual tanks, just follow the leader and hope he knows what he's doing. And listen, this system could work when everything went according to plan. German training was incredible. Their crews knew their jobs. But the second things got chaotic, and battlefields are always chaotic. The whole structure started falling apart. Here's where it gets brutal. Those command tanks were stupidly easy to spot. Multiple antennas sticking up like big targets screaming, "Shoot me first." Every experienced Allied tanker knew to look for the extra antennas. Take out that one vehicle, and you've just crippled an entire platoon. And that's exactly what happened over and over again. When you knocked out that command tank, the other 4 vehicles suddenly couldn't talk to each other. No backup communications, no plan B. Just 4 tanks that went from being part of a coordinated unit to being 4 isolated vehicles trying to figure out what to do next. They couldn't even ask each other what now, because 3 or 4 of them literally couldn't transmit. The range problem made everything worse. Even when German radios were working, that 10-watt FUG-5 transmitter struggled to reach 2 to 3 kilometers in perfect conditions. Start moving, add some terrain. Maybe you're getting 500 meters, maybe less. The radios picked up interference from everything: the tank's own engine, the tracks grinding, electrical systems, nearby vehicles. All of it came through as static on those amplitude modulation systems. Tank commanders had to basically shout into their microphones and hope something got through the noise. Meanwhile, any American Sherman could step up and take command instantly. Lose your platoon leader? Doesn't matter. The next tank in line starts calling the shots, and everyone's still connected. Every single crew member in every single tank can communicate with everyone else. It's like comparing a company where only the CEO has a phone versus a company where everyone's got a smartphone. One sniper takes out the CEO, and the first company's paralyzed. The second company, they don't even skip a beat. Someone else picks up the slack immediately. And those American radios worked at ranges the Germans couldn't believe. 7 miles while moving, 10 to 15 miles when stationary. Crystal clear the whole time because FM didn't care about the engine noise or electrical interference. American tankers could be spread out across an entire sector and still coordinate like they were sitting in the same room. They'd call out enemy positions, warn each other about threats, coordinate flanking maneuvers, request artillery support, all in real time with perfect clarity. The Germans were operating under limitations they couldn't fix. This wasn't about training or tactics. German crews were some of the best trained tankers in the world. It was about fundamental technology gaps that no amount of skill could overcome. American tankers who'd never met each other, who didn't know each other's names, could coordinate complex attacks across miles of desert. German crews in the same platoon sometimes couldn't even talk to the guy 500 meters away. And the worst part? They kept running into situations where they'd watch American units pull off maneuvers that German doctrine said were flat out impossible without visual signals. They'd see Shermans coordinating perfectly through dust storms, around hills, across terrain where nobody could see anybody else. And they couldn't figure out how it was happening because they didn't understand the technology gap they were facing. February 14th to 24th, 1943, Kasserine Pass. This was the first major test where the radio advantage really showed itself. Now here's the thing. Tactically, this was actually a German victory. They pushed American forces back, inflicted heavy casualties, the whole deal. But while the Germans were celebrating their win, their intelligence officers were writing reports that should have terrified high command. Scattered elements of the US 1st Armored Division were coordinating across 50 miles of battlefield. 50 miles. Tank crews who'd never met, who didn't know each other's names, were calling in artillery strikes together, warning each other about German movements, executing combined attacks like they'd been training together for months, all through crystal-clear radio communication that German signals intelligence couldn't believe was possible. The 10th Panzer Division's intelligence section started putting together reports about what they were hearing. American units maintaining communication at ranges where German radios just produced static. But the really disturbing part, every American tank appeared capable of full transmission. Not just the command vehicles like German doctrine assumed, every single tank. That meant destroying one American tank didn't cripple the unit's communications. There was no command vehicle to target, no special antenna to look for. Every Sherman was basically a command vehicle. Think about what German tank commanders were seeing. They'd knock out 2 or 3 American tanks, thinking they'd disrupted the enemy's coordination. But the remaining Shermans just kept working together perfectly, like nothing had happened. The Americans would regroup, adjust their tactics, call for support, all without missing a beat. It didn't make sense according to everything the Germans understood about armoured warfare. You were supposed to target the command elements, disrupt their communications, and watch the enemy formation fall apart. But it wasn't working. German signals units were intercepting American transmissions constantly. They could hear the clarity, hear the coordination happening in real time. Tank commanders talking to each other like they were having normal conversations. Crews warning their buddies about threats. Everyone calling out positions and movements. The Germans weren't just hearing orders flowing down from command. They were hearing lateral communication between individual tanks, peer-to-peer coordination that their own system couldn't support. And those German FUG-5 radios? Operating on amplitude modulation between 27 and 33 MHz, they were getting crushed by interference. That 10-watt transmitter couldn't push through to 2 or 3 kilometers, even when conditions were perfect. When tanks were actually moving and fighting, hundreds of meters at best, every electrical system in the tank created noise, every spark plug firing, every track link grinding. The AM system picked it all up as static that drowned out voices. Meanwhile, American FM radios were delivering clear communication at 7 miles while moving. The technology just cut through all that interference like it wasn't even there. While German commanders were shouting into their microphones hoping someone could hear them through the noise, American tankers were having clear conversations across distances that should have been impossible. They'd coordinate flanking moves with units they couldn't even see. Call in artillery on targets miles away. Warn each other about threats before they became problems. Here's what made it worse for the Germans. They didn't have enough transceivers to go around anyway. Even if the technology had been better, they were only putting full two-way radios in about 20% of their tanks. It was a production bottleneck they couldn't fix. The Americans, they'd standardized the whole thing back in 1941. Every Sherman rolling off the assembly line got a full radio set. By the time Kasserine Pass happened, that meant thousands of fully networked tanks in the field. The battle reports coming out of Tunisia should have been a massive wake-up call. German forces were winning tactically but losing the information war completely. American coordination was operating on a level that German doctrine didn't account for because German technology couldn't support it. And this was just North Africa. The pattern was about to get even clearer in Italy. September 1943. American armor hit Sicily and then mainland Italy, and the radio advantage just got more obvious. Italy's terrain should have been a nightmare for radio communications. Mountains, valleys, hills blocking line of sight everywhere. The kind of place where you'd think visual signals would be essential. But the Americans were coordinating through terrain that should have made it impossible. Shermans on opposite sides of mountains talking to each other perfectly. crews in valleys coordinating with crews on ridge lines they couldn't even see. The Germans kept running into the same problem. American units synchronizing attacks from positions where there was no way they should have been able to communicate. And the German response? They tried jamming. They actually attempted to jam American frequencies, disrupt those FM signals that were causing them so many headaches. It failed completely. FM technology was basically immune to the jamming techniques that worked against AM systems. The Americans didn't even notice most of the German jamming attempts because the frequency modulation just filtered it out as background noise. Meanwhile, any attempt to jam German AM frequencies worked perfectly because that's how AM systems worked. They picked up everything as interference. Here's where the time difference really mattered. American fire missions, calling in artillery support, took 3 to 5 minutes from request to shells landing. German fire missions? 15 to 30 minutes. Think about that gap in actual combat. You spot an enemy position, you want artillery on it right now, not half an hour from now. By the time German artillery finally showed up, targets had usually moved. American artillery was hitting targets that were still exactly where the tank crews had called them in because the response was so fast. The Battle of Gela in Sicily showed something interesting. British forces were there, watching both sides operate. And when the British started evaluating whose radio systems they wanted to copy for their own future development, they went with the American designs, not the German ones. The Brits had their own radio systems, but they recognized that the American approach, full two-way communication in every vehicle, was the future. German technology wasn't even in the conversation. Get this. American tanks were achieving total coordination with each other. Every tank talking to every other tank, working together as a unified force. German tanks, about 20% actually had full communication capability. 1 in 5. The other 4 were operating partially or completely isolated from their buddies. It's like trying to play a team sport where only one guy on your team can hear the plays being called. German crews weren't bad at their jobs. They were extremely well trained, experienced, disciplined, but they were fighting with a handicap they couldn't overcome through skill or tactics. When you can't talk to the tank next to you, when you can't warn him about threats, when you can't coordinate your movements, you're not really fighting as a unit. You're fighting as individuals who happen to be near each other. The Americans had figured out something fundamental about modern warfare. Information sharing wasn't a luxury, it was the foundation. Every tank being able to communicate meant every tank could contribute to the tactical picture. A Sherman on the far left flank could warn the entire formation about enemy movement. A tank taking fire could immediately call for support from units miles away. Commanders could adjust plans in real time based on what every single crew was reporting. By late 1943, the pattern was undeniable. The Germans were losing the electromagnetic war even when they won individual battles. American units were operating with a level of coordination that German forces simply couldn't match. And the gap wasn't closing, it was getting wider. The Americans were producing radios faster than they were producing tanks. Every Sherman that rolled off the line got its full radio set installed. Meanwhile, Germany was still struggling to put transceivers in even a quarter of their armoured vehicles. Italy proved what North Africa had hinted at. This wasn't a fluke or a temporary advantage. The American communication superiority was systematic, deliberate, and devastating. And it was about to get even worse for Germany when the fighting moved to France, June 1944, D-Day. American armour hit the beaches of Normandy, and the terrain ahead was basically designed for radio warfare. The hedgerows of northern France, massive dirt walls covered in thick vegetation dividing every field into its own fortress. Visibility? Maybe 50 meters. Perfect ambush country, and perfect terrain to show why radio communication mattered more than anything else. German tanks trying to coordinate in the hedgerows were basically blind. Their short-range radios couldn't penetrate the vegetation. Tank commanders had to physically move to high ground just to get a signal out. By the time they communicated what they'd seen, the situation had already changed. American tankers, talking to each other constantly through the hedgerows like the walls and vegetation weren't even there. FM signals pushed through obstacles that stopped AM cold. Operation Cobra, the breakthrough that got Allied forces out of Normandy. It worked because American tanks could coordinate in zero visibility conditions. Units moving through a green maze of hedgerows, still working together like they had GPS. They didn't. They just had radios that actually worked. Germany finally tried to fix their problem. They rushed FUG-7 and FUG-8 radio systems into production. Better range, better power, attempting to close the gap that had been killing them for 2 years. But it was 1944. Way too little, way too late. Even if these new radios matched American systems, and they didn't, Germany couldn't produce enough to matter. Here's the crazy part about production. Americans had made over 50,000 SCR radio sets by this point. They'd built 49,324 Sherman tanks total, and every single one got a full radio system. Every single one. Germany? Around 6,000 FUG-5 transceivers for approximately 12,000 medium and heavy tanks. Outproduced 5-to-1 on radios while being outproduced 4-to-1 on tanks, and those German radios were still only going into about 20% of their armoured vehicles. 4 out of 5 German tanks rolled into battle with receive-only capability or no radio at all. Americans had a fully networked force. Germans had a communications system that was broken by design. Think about actual combat in France. American tank units operated as genuine teams. Everybody could talk, contribute information, adjust to changing situations in real time. German units still used that rigid hierarchy where orders flowed down from command vehicles that were easy to identify and easier to target. Take out the command tank, and you've got 4 isolated vehicles. The hedgerows destroyed any German advantage in tank design. Doesn't matter if your Panther has better armor and a better gun if you can't coordinate with your other Panthers. Meanwhile, Shermans that were arguably inferior one-on-one were winning because 4 or 5 could coordinate perfectly, while 4 or 5 German tanks couldn't. American commanders adjusted strategies on the fly based on instant feedback from every unit. German commanders worked with information that was minutes or hours old. In modern warfare, minutes matter. By the time German command made a decision based on outdated intel, Americans had already adjusted to 3 new situations. France was where the communication gap became completely insurmountable. Germany couldn't produce enough new radios, couldn't retrofit existing tanks fast enough, couldn't train crews on new systems while fighting a war on multiple fronts. The American advantage that started as an edge had become an absolute chasm. Here's the wild part about all of this. German commanders saw American coordination in every single battle. They watched it happen at Kasserine Pass, through Sicily, across Italy, in the hedgerows of France. They witnessed the results over and over again. But they never fully understood what was actually beating them. German after-action reports kept talking about American tactical superiority. They'd note the coordination, the teamwork, how American units seemed to know where each other were at all times. But they kept thinking it was about tactics and training. They didn't realize they were looking at a technological revolution hiding in plain sight. The answer was literally in the air between the tanks. Electromagnetic waves they couldn't see carrying information they couldn't intercept clearly. Get this, Germany kept building better individual tanks. Thicker armor, bigger guns, more advanced targeting systems. The Panther, the Tiger, these were legitimately superior tanks to the Sherman in almost every measurable way. Better armor protection, better penetration, better everything if you're comparing one tank to one tank. And that was the problem. They were stuck thinking about tank versus tank when the Americans had moved on to thinking about system versus system. Every German engineering decision focused on making a superior individual platform. How do we make this tank better? How do we give it more firepower, more protection, more mobility? Those are good questions if you're designing for one-on-one duels. But modern warfare wasn't about duels anymore. It was about networks. It was about information flow. It was about multiple units working together as a coordinated whole. The Americans had figured this out back in 1941 when they standardized those radio systems. They weren't trying to build the best tank, they were trying to build the best tank force. There's a huge difference. A Sherman was arguably an adequate tank, not exceptional, but 49,324 Shermans that could all talk to each other? That was exceptional. That was revolutionary. That was 49,324 nodes in the world's first armoured battlefield network. Network-centric warfare, that's what modern militaries call it now. The idea that connected adequate platforms beat isolated superior platforms. Everyone thinks this concept started with the Internet age, with digital communications, with satellites and computers. Nope. It started in 1942, when the first Sherman with an SCR 508 radio entered combat. The principle was exactly the same. Connection equals power, isolation equals vulnerability. Listen to what Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel reportedly said at Germany's surrender. "We knew how to build better tanks, but you knew how to make them work together." Doesn't matter if that quote is exactly accurate or somewhat legendary. The truth it represents is completely real. Germany had superior engineering on individual platforms and completely missed the bigger picture. Those 181 pounds of radio equipment in every Sherman proved more decisive than any armour plate or gun. Think about that. The most important component wasn't the 75mm gun or the sloped armour everyone talks about. It was the communication system that let every crew coordinate with every other crew. That transformed the M4 Sherman from an adequate medium tank into part of a weapon system that included every other American tank on the battlefield. German forces discovered this reality the hard way, at Kasserine Pass, in Italy's mountains, across France's hedgerows, in Germany's final battles. American tanks kept demonstrating coordination that German doctrine said was impossible without visual contact. And Germany never developed an effective counter because they never fully grasped what they were up against. You can't counter a technology you don't understand. The electromagnetic spectrum victory proved more decisive than any advantage in armour or firepower. While Germany obsessed over thicker plates and bigger guns, America built a hive mind that rendered individual superiority meaningless. The side with superior communications defeated the side with superior weapons. The network defeated the platform. The connected overcame the isolated. And this transformation happened largely invisible to German forces until it was way too late to matter. So what happened after the war? Germany rebuilt their military in the 1950s, and guess what they prioritized? Communications. Every single Leopard tank they manufactured got comprehensive radio systems. No more of that, only the command tank can transmit nonsense. The German Bundeswehr training manuals literally included lessons from World War II, and one of them explicitly states, "The defeat of superior German tanks by inferior American vehicles with superior radios teaches that information dominance outweighs platform superiority." They learned the lesson. Took a whole war to figure it out, but they learned it. Modern military doctrine traces directly back to those SCR 508 radios from 1942. The digital stuff, the satellite communications, the computer networks, all of that is built on the same principle. Connect your forces, share information instantly, fight as a system instead of as individuals. Network-centric warfare didn't start with the Internet. It started when American engineers figured out how to put a working FM radio in every tank, and history keeps proving this lesson over and over. 1991. Gulf War. Coalition forces with superior communications absolutely destroyed Iraqi forces who had individually superior Soviet-designed tanks but couldn't coordinate worth a damn. Sound familiar? Same exact pattern. The side with better radios won, not the side with better armor. 2003, same thing. American forces demonstrated again that fighting as a connected network beats fighting as isolated platforms. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The most powerful weapon of World War II wasn't the atomic bomb, wasn't the radar, wasn't some secret super weapon. It was 181 pounds of radio equipment that let soldiers talk to each other clearly. That's it. While Germany spent the entire war obsessing over building the perfect tank, thicker armor, bigger guns, better everything, America built something way more dangerous, a hive mind of steel where every tank knew what every other tank was doing. 49,324 Sherman tanks rolled off American assembly lines. But they weren't just 49,324 individual vehicles. They were 49,324 nodes in a network that Germany never saw coming. Every single one could communicate with every other one, every crew connected to every other crew. That turned an adequate tank into part of a weapon system that was genuinely revolutionary. The Germans discovered too late that you can build the best tank in the world and still lose if you can't make it work with the other tanks around it. They had superior engineering, superior armor, superior firepower, and they lost the communication war so badly that none of it mattered. The electromagnetic waves carrying voices between Sherman crews proved more powerful than the armor-piercing rounds fired by German 88mm guns. Connection equaled survival. Isolation equaled defeat. And that invisible advantage, the one nobody could see, the one the Germans never fully understood, determined the outcome of the war more surely than any visible superiority in weapons or armor. The revolution in warfare that everyone associates with modern technology actually started in 1942. From that moment on, the side with better communications would beat the side with better weapons. Every single time. So what happened after the war? Germany rebuilt their military in the 1950s, and guess what they prioritized? Communications. Every single Leopard tank they manufactured got comprehensive radio systems. No more of that, only the command tank can transmit nonsense. The German Bundeswehr training manuals literally included lessons from World War II, and one of them explicitly states, "The defeat of superior German tanks by inferior American vehicles with superior radios teaches that information dominance outweighs platform superiority." They learned the lesson. Took a whole war to figure it out, but they learned it. Modern military doctrine traces directly back to those SCR 508 radios from 1942. The digital stuff, the satellite communications, the computer networks, all of that is built on the same principle. Connect your forces, share information instantly, fight as a system instead of as individuals. Network-centric warfare didn't start with the internet. It started when American engineers figured out how to put a working FM radio in every tank, and history keeps proving this lesson over and over. 1991. Gulf War. Coalition forces with superior communications absolutely destroyed Iraqi forces who had individually superior Soviet-designed tanks but couldn't coordinate worth a damn. Sound familiar? Same exact pattern. The side with better radios won, not the side with better armor. 2003, same thing. American forces demonstrated again that fighting as a connected network beats fighting as isolated platforms. Here's the thing nobody talks about. The most powerful weapon of World War II wasn't the atomic bomb, wasn't the radar, wasn't some secret super weapon. It was 181 pounds of radio equipment that let soldiers talk to each other clearly. That's it. While Germany spent the entire war obsessing over building the perfect tank, thicker armor, bigger guns, better everything, America built something way more dangerous. A hive mind of steel where every tank knew what every other tank was doing. 49,324 Sherman tanks rolled off American assembly lines. But they weren't just 49,324 individual vehicles. They were 49,324 nodes in a network that Germany never saw coming. Every single one could communicate with every other one. Every crew connected to every other crew. That turned an adequate tank into part of a weapon system that was genuinely revolutionary. The Germans discovered too late that you can build the best tank in the world and still lose if you can't make it work with the other tanks around it. They had superior engineering, superior armor, superior firepower. And they lost the communication war so badly that none of it mattered. The electromagnetic waves carrying voices between Sherman crews proved more powerful than the armor-piercing rounds fired by German 88mm guns. Connection equaled survival. Isolation equaled defeat. And that invisible advantage, the one nobody could see, the one the Germans never fully understood, determined the outcome of the war more surely than any visible superiority in weapons or armor. The revolution in warfare that everyone associates with modern technology actually started in 1942. From that moment on, the side with better communications would beat the side with better weapons. Every single time. If this story blew your mind, hit that like button because there's way more hidden history like this that nobody talks about. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Drop a comment and let me know. What other invisible weapons from history do you want to hear about? The stuff that changed everything but nobody remembers? I'll catch you in the next video.